Thanks. Just Suzanne Levy in the chat just popped in a comment. I'm concerned about the back seat that fairness seems to be taking. The UK report on transgender participation seemed to recognise that it was impossible to provide both inclusivity and fairness across all sports. I'd also like to see more information in the guidelines on the rights of people who might like to invoke Clause 49 of the Human Rights Act, which says that people can be excluded on the basis of sex when strength, stamina, etc. are relevant. Nikki, I'll throw to you for that last one because I know it came up in the last webinar. But just before that, thanks, Suzanne. For those who haven't read the UK guidelines, they seek to, and again, I'm bluntly summarising, but almost categorise sport into collision sports and where safety and fairness might be an issue. So they've sort of gone many, many steps further than these do around prescribing what action should be taken. So it was a deliberate step from Sport New Zealand not to go that far. I think start from the principle-based approach over time, and as we've mentioned, there will be reviews and there might be iterations required along those lines, but where things sit at the moment is working with each code to actually understand how that best suits them, and that I guess that's what came out of the first lot of consultation and seems to be what the preferred approach was from there. And then Nikki, did you want to touch on the Human Rights Act? Because I know that you've had a view on that, or had a good answer.
I don't want to give like the ultimate view on that clause, but suffice to say it's more complicated than it looks on the cover. There's some case law around this as well. The definition of sex can be a bit tricky. So I think we certainly would not be encouraging people to exclude on the basis just of sex or sexuality or any other grounds based on this clause, right? What we're really looking to do is focus on the positives. We've got a minister, a government, an organisation and a community here that really values inclusion. And what we're seeking to do is as much as we can to make sure that everybody can be part of community sport, right? So that's our focus. When it comes to some of the challenges around fairness and competition, we're aware that it won't necessarily be straightforward, right? And there'll be quite a few matters to take into consideration, and we will be working on that. But the guiding principles won't be speaking to that, and we certainly, I feel it would completely undermine the work if we put something in there and said, but you can discriminate if you want to. That's not the Sport New Zealand position on this, and it's not the legal opinion on this either.
Yeah, thanks, Nikki. And the only thing I'd add to that, I guess, is that we've heard, what I can hear out of this, Suzanne, is that you'd like to see more information in the guidelines of the rights of those people. So there might be an opportunity for us to clarify that in future iterations, or provide some information as an addendum to it. And now you've got your hand up, so go ahead.
Oh, yeah, thanks. I just thought, yes, what I'd like to see is more guidance for, I guess, for officials and volunteers and people managing sports, so that they can handle the inquiries from people who may come to them and say, look, this situation seems really, really unfair. And there will be situations where it's blatantly unfair. You know, somebody, a transgender woman with self-identification can be physically no different to a male. So, you know, in a sports situation, that's very, very relevant. And there will be times when people are really concerned about that. And the education and complaint section in your guidelines only seem to affect transgender or non-binary participants who wish to, you know, dispute something or complain about something, but not for other participants who may just be thinking quietly to themselves or amongst a group that this just doesn't seem to be right or fair. You know, that the sport is, that there's been an impact. There's, you know, the competition doesn't feel like it should. It may be the transgender person isn't having a great time either because of that. So it just seems to be quite a one-sided view of a complaints process.
Yep. Thanks, Suzanne. I think really good couple of points in that for me is people want to be able to have the conversations better and be equipped to answer questions, which I think is really crucial and a really crucial consideration for these guidelines. So definitely take that on board. And I guess with the complaints process, and Nikki may have a view as well, yes, it sits in here because this is the piece of work. There are other complaints processes in the sport environment that someone who isn't maybe a transgender participant might feel aggrieved and can seek some explanations or make a complaint, and perhaps that's something to link in future information that goes out. So yeah, I think that was probably one thought I had.
I think the people administering the sport, it's invaluable. Like they are going to be a bit stuck when somebody comes to them and says, look, you know, there was someone in my opposing team who was you know, clearly had advantages. It changed the game, which it will, and you know, I guess they need to know how to handle that situation.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I've just got a couple of things just to add to this, and I think one of them is to be aware that we expect there to be complaints and mediation processes for sports anyway. What we're trying to do with this guidance is to make sure that people have taken a look at the policy they already have that should enable participant voice, and make sure that it's also approachable, safe and accessible for transgender participants. So we're not trying to say with these guidelines that those processes should only be available for transgender participants. We're just making sure that you've had a good hard look at them to make sure they will support and meet the needs of our transgender people. So that's one clarification to make, I guess. And the other one is that I completely understand your feedback on the fairness side of things, but what I would say is it's not really appropriate at the guiding principles level to cover that off, because issues of fairness vary from sport to sport. So we've had feedback from some sports that are saying, we can manage this. Transgender participation, being fully inclusive, works for us. And we've got mitigations that sort our issues out. So for them, they don't need any particular mitigations. For other sports, mitigations, particularly maybe in the competition space, may be required. But that's a policy level piece of work to do. When Raylene was talking in her introduction about how this isn't about one rule working for all, we really mean that. So that's why we haven't covered that at the high level, because it's not relevant for every sport, but we would be expecting to cover it at the policy level.
Yes, but fairness does barely rate to mention, and it's clearly relevant.
Not necessarily in people's lived experience of managing their sports.
Yeah, look, it's not irrelevant. I'm not saying that. I guess the best support from a principal perspective at the moment is how it's set out. But again, 100% take on that feedback. Thank you.
I just wanted to say that listening to Alika's comment, the thing with these policies is that they cover self-ID, which requires no physical or medical or surgical or any changes whatsoever. So to talk about whether or not any a transgender woman has any physical advantage is it's relevant to obviously what procedures or what medical intervention they have had, and in the case of self-ID that could be absolutely none. So yeah,
Suzanne, it's a good point you're raising, but also I think the value here is in the nuance. So Alika is reminding us that there are a range of transgender women in the community. Some of them will have transitioned earlier, some of them will be transitioning now, some of them won't be physically transitioning, but it's important that we remember the nuance in the conversation, and we don't focus in just on one element of the community. We are trying to be inclusive of everybody, but also it's a complicated, we've got a complicated situation here, and I think Alika raised a really good point about fairness as well, in that, you know, fairness is a difficult thing to work through, and there are many elements to consider when you're developing a policy that's trying to support fairness.
Yes, but traditionally it's been by using 6 categories, and that's worked pretty well.
Well, I guess we're trying to be representative for the future. So when we're taking into account our policy work, we don't just look at status quo. We look at what we think is most relevant, most useful, and most valuable for the present time.
Absolutely, and I mean I love sport. I play a lot of sport and always have, and I want it to be accessible to as many people as possible. And I think you know, the work that you're doing around making it accessible is good. I just think it's in a lot of cases it's not going to be fair on women, and that's my concern. And I think if you look at the FINA decision within an open category, it's a really good option. So people can still participate, which is really, really important. But the fairness isn't compromised. And I wonder sort of whether, as I've been watching this consultation for the last quite a while, a couple of years, and it's like if you look at the UK and FINA and some of the other stuff that's happening, it's like it's moving on and are looking at fairness and realising that there's a bit of a conflict between fairness and inclusion. And it's as if, to me, that Sport New Zealand is just kind of carrying on regardless. And we may end up with a community level sport guidelines that don't kind of match the elite sport thing. And I can see you've highlighted the issues with transitioning between community sport and elite sport, because there's nothing else in between. It's sometimes made to sound like, this is just community sport. It doesn't affect high performance. But there's not this kind of mysterious other sport level that sits in the middle that can kind of iron out all of the issues. It's basically the two different divisions, and I do have concerns about how the fairness aspect will play out when you've got one level without the open category, and then potentially our high performance sports are looking like they will go that way. And yeah, so they're my main concerns.
Well, thanks, Suzanne. Look, yeah, absolutely heard that. And I think that's what we're trying to say. We'll work with each code to sort that out. And then we have left, I guess, some room to review the guiding principles. So it's certainly not a closing off from here. But thanks, we've heard you. That's really excellent input.